I'm Laura Davenport, the author of the poetry collection Dear Vulcan, and today I want to share with you the nature and aim of fiction from Mystery and Manners, Occasional Prose. And I chose this essay because I feel like you can really hear Flannery O'Connor's voice and her sense of humor coming through. There's some amazing kind of one-liners throughout here. And also as someone who is sort of trying to venture a toe into fiction, I think she actually does have some really good, thoughtful advice here. So please give it a listen. I understand that this is a course called How the Writer Writes, and that each week you are exposed to a different writer who holds forth on the subject. The only parallel I can think of to this is having the zoo come to you, one animal at a time. And I suspect that what you hear one week from the giraffe is contradicted the next week by the baboon. My own problem in thinking what I should say to you tonight has been how to interpret such a title as How the Writer Writes. In the first place, there's no such thing as the writer. And I think that if you don't know that by now, you should by the time such a course as this is over. In fact, I predict it is the one thing you can be absolutely certain of learning. What interests the serious writer is not external habits, but what Maritain calls the habit of art. And he explains that habit in this sense means a certain quality or virtue of the mind. The scientist has the habit of science, the artist, the habit of art. Now I'd better stop here and explain how I'm using the word art. Art is a word that immediately scares people off as being a little too grand. But all I mean by art is writing something that is valuable in itself and that works in itself. The basis of art is truth, both in matter and in mode. The person who aims after art in his work aims after truth, in an imaginative sense, no more and no less. St. Thomas said that the artist is concerned with the good of that which is made, and that will have to be the basis of my few words on the subject of fiction. Now you'll see that this kind of approach eliminates many things from the discussion. It eliminates any concern with the motivation of the writer, except as this finds its place inside the work. It also eliminates any concern with the reader in his market sense. It also eliminates that tedious controversy that always rages between people who declare that they write to express themselves and those who declare that they write to fill their pocketbooks, if possible. In this connection, I always think of Henry James. I know of no writer who was hotter after the dollar than James was, or who was more of a conscientious artist. It is true, I think, that these are times when the financial rewards for sorry writing are much greater than those for good writing. There are certain cases in which, if you can only learn to write poorly enough, you can make a great deal of money. But it is not true that if you write well, you won't get published at all. It is true that if you want to write well and live well at the same time, you'd better arrange to inherit money or marry a stockbroker or a rich woman who can operate a typewriter. In any case, whether you write to make money or to express your soul or to ensure civil rights or to irritate your grandmother will be a matter for you and your analyst, and the point of departure for this discussion will be the good of the written work. The kind of written work I'm going to talk about is story writing, because that's the only kind I know anything about. I'll call any length of fiction a story, whether it be a novel or a shorter piece, and I'll call anything a story in which specific characters and events influence each other to form a meaningful narrative. I find that most people know what a story is until they sit down to write one. Then they find themselves writing a sketch with an essay woven through it, or an essay with a sketch woven through it, or an editorial with a character in it, or a case history with a moral, or some other mongrel thing. When they realize they aren't writing stories, they decide that the remedy for this is to learn something that they refer to as the technique of the short story, or the technique of the novel. Technique in the minds of many is something rigid, something like a formula that you impose on the material. But in the best stories, it is something organic, something that grows out of the material. And this being the case, it is different for every story of any account that has ever been written. I think we have to begin thinking about stories at a much more fundamental level. So I want to talk about one quality of fiction which I think is its least common denominator, the fact that it is concrete, and about a few of the qualities that follow from this. We will be concerned in this with the reader in his fundamental human sense, because the nature of fiction is in large measure determined by the nature of our perceptive apparatus. The beginning of human knowledge is through the senses, and the fiction writer begins where human perception begins. He appeals through the senses, and you cannot appeal to the senses with abstractions. It is a good deal easier for most people to state an abstract idea than to describe and thus recreate some object that they actually see. But the world of the fiction writer is full of matter, and this is what the beginning fiction writers are very loath to create. They are concerned primarily with unfleshed ideas and emotions. They are apt to be reformers and want to write because they are possessed not by a story but by the bare bones of some abstract notion. They are conscious of problems, not of people, of questions and issues, not of the texture of existence, of case histories and of everything that has a sociological smack, instead of with all those concrete details of life that make actual the mystery of our position on earth. The Manichaeans separated spirit and matter. To them, all material things were evil. They sought pure spirit and tried to approach the infinite directly without any mediation of matter. This is also pretty much the modern spirit, and for the sensibility infected with it, fiction is hard, if not impossible, to write, because fiction is so very much an incarnational art. One of the most common and saddest spectacles is that of a person of really fine sensibility and acute psychological perception trying to write fiction by using these qualities alone. This type of writer will put down one intensely emotional or keenly perceptive sentence after the other, and the result will be complete dullness. The fact is that the materials of the fiction writer are the humblest. Fiction is about everything human, and we are made out of dust, and if you scorn getting yourself dusty, then you shouldn't try to write fiction. It's not a grand enough job for you. In a strictly naturalistic work, the detail is there because it is natural to life, not because it is natural to the work. In a work of art, we can be extremely literal without being in the least naturalistic. Art is selective, and its truthfulness is the truthfulness of the essential that creates movement. The novel works by a slower accumulation of detail than the short story does. The short story requires more drastic procedures than the novel because more has to be accomplished in less space. The details have to carry more immediate weight. In good fiction, certain of the details will tend to accumulate meaning from the story itself, and when this happens, they become symbolic in their action. Now, the word symbol scares a good many people off, just as the word art does. They seem to feel that a symbol is some mysterious thing put in arbitrarily by the writer to frighten the common reader, sort of a literary Masonic grip that is only for the initiated. They seem to think that it is a way of saying something that you aren't actually saying, and so if they can be got to read a reputedly symbolic work at all, they approach it as if it were a problem in algebra. Find X. And when they do find or think they find this abstraction, X, then they go off with an elaborate sense of satisfaction and the notion that they have understood the story. Many students confuse the process of understanding a thing with understanding it. I think that for the fiction writer himself, symbols are something he uses simply as a matter of course. You might say that these are details that, while having their essential place in the literal level of the story, operate in depth as well as on the surface, increasing the story in every direction. I think the way to read a book is always to see what happens, but in a good novel, more always happens than we are able to take in at once. More happens than meets the eye. The mind is led on by what it sees into the greater depths that the book's symbols naturally suggest. This is what is meant when critics say that a novel operates on several levels. The truer the symbol, the deeper it leads you, the more meaning it opens up. The kind of vision the fiction writer needs to have or to develop in order to increase the meaning of his story is called anagogical vision. And that is the kind of vision that is able to see different levels of reality in one image or one situation. The medieval commentators on Scripture found three kinds of meaning in the literal level of the sacred text. One they called allegorical, in which one fact pointed to another. One they called tropological or moral, which had to do with what should be done. And one they called anagogical, which had to do with the divine life and our participation in it. Although this was a method applied to biblical exegesis, it was also an attitude toward all of creation, and a way of reading nature which included most possibilities, and I think it is this enlarged view of the human scene that the fiction writer has to cultivate if he is ever going to write stories that have any chance of becoming a permanent part of our literature. It seems to be a paradox that the larger and more complex the personal view, the easier it is to compress it into fiction. People have a habit of saying, "What is the theme of your story?" And they expect you to give them a statement. "The theme of my story is the economic pressure of the machine on the middle class," or some such absurdity. And when they've got a statement like that, they go off happy and feel it is no longer necessary to read the story. Some people have the notion that you read the story and then climb out of it into the meaning. But for the fiction writer himself, the whole story is the meaning, because it is an experience, not an abstraction. Now, the second common characteristic of fiction follows from this, and it is that fiction is presented in such a way that the reader has the sense that it is unfolding around him. This doesn't mean he has to identify himself with the character or feel compassion for the character or anything like that. It just means that fiction has to be largely presented rather than reported. Another way to say it is that though fiction is a narrative art, it relies heavily on the element of drama. It is from the kind of world the writer creates, from the kind of character and details he invests it with, that a reader can find the intellectual meaning of a book. Once this is found, however, it cannot be drained off and used as a substitute for the book. As the late John Peel Bishop said, "You can't say Cézanne painted apples in a tablecloth and have said what Cézanne painted." The novelist makes his statements by selection, and if he is any good, he selects every word for a reason, every detail for a reason, every incident for a reason, and arranges them in a certain time sequence for a reason. He demonstrates something that cannot possibly be demonstrated any other way than with a whole novel. Art forms evolve until they reach their ultimate perfection, or until they reach some state of petrifaction, or until some new element is grafted on and a new art form made. But however the past of fiction has been, or however the future will be, the present state of the case is that a piece of fiction must be very much a self-contained dramatic unit. This means that it must carry its meaning inside it. It means that any abstractly expressed compassion or piety or morality in a piece of fiction is only a statement added to it. It means that you can't make an inadequate dramatic action complete by putting a statement of meaning on the end of it, or in the middle of it, or at the beginning of it. It means that when you write fiction, you are speaking with character and action, not about character and action. The writer's moral sense must coincide with his dramatic sense. It's said that when Henry James received a manuscript that he didn't like, he would return it with the comment, "You have chosen a good subject and are treating it in a straightforward manner." This usually pleased the person getting the manuscript back, but it was the worst thing James could think of to say, for he knew better than anyone else that the straightforward manner is seldom equal to the complications of the good subject. There may never be anything new to say, but there is always a new way to say it. And since in art the way of saying a thing becomes a part of what is said, every work of art is unique and requires fresh attention. It's always wrong, of course, to say that you can't do this or you can't do that in fiction. You can do anything you can get away with, but nobody has ever gotten away with much. There's a certain grain of stupidity that the writer of fiction can hardly do without, and this is the quality of having to stare, of not getting the point at once. The longer you look at one object, the more of the world you see in it. And it's well to remember that the serious fiction writer always writes about the whole world, no matter how limited his particular scene. People are always complaining that the modern novelist has no hope and the picture he paints of the world is unbearable. The only answer to this is that people without hope do not write novels. Writing a novel is a terrible experience, during which the hair often falls out and the teeth decay. I'm always highly irritated by people who imply that writing fiction is an escape from reality. It is a plunge into reality, and it's very shocking to the system. If the novelist is not sustained by a hope of money, then he must be sustained by a hope of salvation, or he simply won't survive the ordeal. People without hope not only don't write novels, but what is more to the point, they don't read them. They don't take long looks at anything because they lack the courage. The way to despair is to refuse to have any kind of experience, and the novel, of course, is a way to have experience. The lady who only read books that improved her mind was taking a safe course, and a hopeless one. She'll never know whether her mind is improved or not, but should she ever by some mistake read a great novel, she'll know mighty well that something is happening to her. The type of mind that can understand good fiction is not necessarily the educated mind, but it is at all times the kind of mind that is willing to have its sense of mystery deepened by contact with reality, and its sense of reality deepened by contact with mystery. Fiction should be both canny and uncanny. In a good deal of popular criticism, there's the notion operating that all fiction has to be about the average man and has to depict average, ordinary, everyday life, and every fiction writer must produce what used to be called a slice of life. But if life, in that sense, satisfied us, there would be no sense in producing literature at all. You may think from all I say that the reason I write is to make the reader see what I see, and that writing fiction is primarily a missionary activity. Let me straighten this out. Last spring I talked here, and one of the girls asked me, "Miss O'Connor, why do you write?" And I said, "Because I'm good at it." And at once I felt a considerable disapproval in the atmosphere. I felt that this was not thought by the majority to be a high-minded answer, but it was the only answer I could give. I had not been asked why I write the way I do, but why I write at all. And to that question, there is only one legitimate answer. There's no excuse for anyone to write fiction for public consumption unless he has been called to do so by the presence of a gift. It is the nature of fiction not to be good for much unless it is good in itself. A gift of any kind is a considerable responsibility. It is a mystery in itself, something gratuitous and wholly undeserved, something whose real uses will probably always be hidden from us. Usually the artist has to suffer certain deprivations in order to use his gift with integrity. Art is a virtue of the practical intellect, and the practice of any virtue demands a certain asceticism and a very definite leaving behind of the part of the ego. The writer has to judge himself with a stranger's eye and a stranger's severity. The prophet in him has to see the freak. No art is sunk in the self, but rather, in art the self becomes self-forgetful in order to meet the demands of the thing seen and the thing being made. St. Thomas called art reason in making. This is a very cold and very beautiful definition, and if it is unpopular today, this is because reason has lost ground among us. As grace and nature have been separated, so imagination and reason have been separated, and this always means an end to art. The artist uses his reason to discover an answering reason in everything he sees. For him, to be reasonable is to find in the object, in the situation, in the sequence, the spirit which makes it itself. This is not an easy or simple thing to do. It is to intrude upon the timeless, and that is only done by the violence of a single-minded respect for the truth. It follows from all this that there is no technique that can be discovered and applied to make it possible for one to write. If you go to a school where there are classes in writing, these classes should not be to teach you how to write, but to teach you the limits and possibilities of words and the respect due them. One thing that is always with the writer, no matter how long he has written or how good he is the continuing process of learning how to write. As soon as the writer learns to write, as soon as he knows what he's going to find and discovers a way to say what he knew all along, or worse still, a way to say nothing, he is finished. If a writer is any good, what he makes will have its source in a realm much larger than that which his conscious mind can encompass, and will always be a greater surprise to him than it can ever be to his reader. I don't know which is worse, to have a bad teacher or no teacher at all. In any case, I believe the teacher's work should largely be negative. He can't put the gift into you, but if he finds it there, he can try to keep it from going in an obviously wrong direction. We can learn how not to write, but this is a discipline that does not simply concern writing itself, but concerns the whole intellectual life. A mind cleared of false emotion and false sentiment and egocentricity is going to have at least those roadblocks removed from its path. If you don't think cheaply, then at least there won't be the quality of cheapness in your writing, even though you may not be able to write well. The teacher can try to weed out what is positively bad, and this should be the aim of the whole college. Any discipline can help your writing: logic, mathematics, theology, and of course, drawing. Anything that helps you to see, anything that makes you look. The writer should never be ashamed of staring. There is nothing that doesn't require his attention.